It's wonderful to be with you this afternoon, and I want to begin by congratulating CEDA, Professor Stephen Martin, on what is a timely and important report. It's timely because we are having some challenging debates around immigration, race and multiculturalism, debates which are happening across many Western liberal democracies. Important because immigration is so fundamental to our national story. We are a country with two foundations. We have an ancient foundation in the oldest continuing civilization in the world, and we have a modern foundation as a nation of immigration. Unless you are an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander Australian, you are either a migrant or a descendant of a migrant. So how we do immigration is essential to how we fare as an Australian society. The history of our immigration program has been a successful one. If you look in particular at the post-war migration story, you see very clearly delineated a nation-building journey. It was there written at the outset. We had a policy of immigration that was animated by the aspiration of populating or perish. We were one of the few countries in the world to have a government department dedicated to immigration. And the rationale for conducting this was to ensure that immigration would strengthen Australia. We had iconic projects like the Snowy River Hydro Scheme. That gave people a focal point, a manifestation of what nation building looked like. Now in the 21st century, we are faced with the challenge of renewing this story of nation building. We perhaps won't be having as many iconic projects as the projects of the past, but nonetheless we should be challenging ourselves to tell this story of nation building better. I believe we're in a good position to tell this story. If you look at how Australian society regards immigration, you will find, as the report from CEDA outlines, that a majority of Australians are comfortable with current levels of migration. Yes, there is a minority of the population, a sizable one, that may be uncomfortable with it, but the majority of people believe that the current level of immigration is about right, or believe that the immigration intake could be even higher. If you compare that to Europe, you have the opposite. The majority of people in European countries will believe that migration is too high. That gives us a strong foundation for conducting a mature public conversation about migration. As well, we have widespread public endorsement of our multiculturalism. It is something that is emphatically supported by 86% of Australians, according to the Scanlon Foundation's research on this. So close to 9 out of 10 Australians believe that multiculturalism is good for the country. And the reasons for that are also outlined in the research. It's because people understand that multiculturalism adds to the economic fabric of our society, and also that multiculturalism aids in the integration of those who arrive as migrants. I outline these 2 points because I believe this is the template for what our nation-building story around immigration and multiculturalism can be about. There's no need for us to be reinventing our policies or our language around immigration and multiculturalism. It's already there. We just need to renew it. There is a challenge on two fronts, though, in renewing this nation-building story. First, you might say that the nation-building dimension of immigration has somewhat faded away in our public discourse. As Stephen alluded to earlier, more often than not now, immigration is spoken of predominantly in terms of security, national security, border security. What has been lost has been some of the aspiration behind immigration, the idea that we're building not only stronger borders, but a stronger society. There's a second challenge in the resurgence of xenophobic populism. Again, this is something that is happening in many Western liberal democracies. We've seen it in Europe, where far-right nationalist parties are gaining in support and strength. We've seen it in the UK through the Brexit referendum and the role that anti-immigration sentiment played in driving the vote for the UK to leave the European Union. We see it currently in the United States in the presidential election there, where Republican candidate Donald Trump has very clearly targeted migrants, Muslims, and has made it part of his platform to endorse a strident nationalism. In fixing this, we do need to have contributions from corporate Australia, as well as from organisations that conduct research. So I do welcome CEDA's work in putting on the table the case for immigration, and I hope that it can start some conversations. There are three aspects of the report that I want to reflect on very briefly, which I think outlines some of the issues that we need to discuss with greater maturity and to deliberate upon. One is, of course, temporary migration. If you look at the model of migration Australia has had since the end of the Second World War, there was an elegant simplicity to it. We took in migrants from different countries, they would settle here, they would live here, and they would become Australian citizens. They came here as permanent migrants. Over the last 2 decades, we have seen the advent of temporary migration. The pathway from arriving here in Australia to becoming a full member of our society has become more complex. In a global world, there is more movement. People may decide to come to Australia for a few years and then move to another country or return to their home country. Others may remain. It's important that we have a conversation about whether this is in line with the nation-building logic of immigration in Australia, because temporary migration has evolved and developed without necessarily a sustained public debate about temporary migration. I was struck by one of the reflections that Glenn Withers provided in his chapter in the report, where he said, and I quote, and this is reflecting on the last 15 to 20 years, increasingly the immigration program veered away from the post-war focus on broad-based workforce enhancement and commitment to Australian settlement to meeting narrower and more immediate employer and state political requirements. One danger with temporary migration is that we may be undermining the value of citizenship and the impetus of nation building if we don't get things right. This isn't a rejection of temporary migration at large, but it is an important question to be posed. If you compare Australian success with the experience of Europe with immigration, you find, for example, that many European countries adopted a guest worker model with immigration. Take the example of Germany, which took in millions of Turkish migrants in the years following the Second World War, but never integrated those migrants as full and equal German citizens. It wasn't until the year 2000, for example, that you could be eligible for German citizenship if you didn't have German ancestry or blood going back to your grandparents. We didn't have that approach here in Australia. Many others have written about temporary migration of late. I think, for example, of the important contribution that Peter Mayers has made through his recently published book, Not Quite Australian. One thing we must avoid is the phenomenon of having permanently temporary migrants in Australia. There must be a pathway for those who may arrive here temporarily but may want to take out citizenship and we've got to ensure that we retain that value of citizenship. I'm glad to see that some of these questions have been posed in this CEDA report. Joanna Howe's chapter has a strong emphasis on protecting the value of a fair go for migrant workers. She highlights the need for a strong and well-resourced inspectorate when it comes to immigration policy. Similarly, Anna Boucher's contribution talks about preventing the exploitation of temporary visa holders and the ethnicisation of segments of the labour market. These are important questions to consider. A second theme of this report worth deliberating upon further is the question of the benefits of immigration. We can't take for granted that everyone will understand that they will benefit from immigration. Some may well feel a sense of loss from immigration, whether that's cultural or economic. We cannot assume that change, that globalisation will be experienced as positive by everyone in our society. There's a general consensus reflected in this report that there are positive net effects from migration, although just what the magnitude of those net effects may be depends on how you measure it. One factor is, of course, time. The time frame over which you measure the net benefit of migration matters. If you're measuring it over 10 or 15 years, the benefits will be relatively modest. If you were to measure the benefits of immigration over 40 or 50 years, the benefits will look a lot different. Think, for example, of the contribution someone like a Frank Lowy would have made to the Australian economy and society. He came here in the years following the Second World War. If we were only to measure the contribution that he made in the first 15 years that he lived in this society, as opposed to the 50 years or 60 that he's been in Australian society, you see there a very clear illustration of how time frame makes an enormous difference. I labour this point only to emphasise that we need to take a generational view of immigration and its benefits. If we don't look at it through the generations, we won't truly understand what immigration brings to our country and how it enriches our economy. Finally, the issue of regional settlement. I welcome the emphasis in this report on the regional aspects of how we settle migrants. Clearly there are issues around congestion and infrastructure that we have to consider with respect to our major cities. It's only natural that the majority of migrants will gravitate to our major cities because that's where their networks will be, that's where communities will be, that's where support will lie. But we should be creative about how we settle populations and our migrant intake. And this should include a possible focus on regional centres and incentives for migrants to settle in regional places. We should also be realistic about some of the challenges involved here. Those of you familiar with the Scanlon Foundation's research on social cohesion may know, for example, that they found recently that hostility towards cultural diversity can have a geographic dimension to it. Namely, those in metropolitan areas are on average more likely to be more positive towards cultural diversity, whereas we may have some challenges in regional centres. What this means is that if we are going to conduct regional settlement, it has to be supported by social infrastructure and efforts to ensure that there's a welcoming environment for new arrivals. Let me conclude with the reflection on where we need to go with this debate. We can start the debate, we can try and bring things back to a middle ground, but I believe we should be guided by certain values. We must conduct any debate about immigration based on our values as a liberal democracy. That includes a commitment to equality and non-discrimination. We have had a non-discriminatory immigration policy in Australia for the last 4 or 5 decades. It has enjoyed widespread public support. We should not be entertaining any idea about introducing discrimination based on religion or based on race when it concerns the conduct of our immigration policy. We should be unapologetic about a commitment to equality and non-discrimination. Because if we don't apply those values in the realm of immigration, it becomes very easy then not to apply those values elsewhere in our society. We must also be guided by the civic aspiration of our multiculturalism. Our multiculturalism has had a certain character about it here in Australia. It hasn't been about celebrating cultural diversity for its own sake. It has been about enhancing and enriching the Australian national identity, about ensuring that everyone can be comfortable in their own skin and can become Australian without having to discard their cultural identity or heritage. It is also about ensuring that people enjoy a fair go and are treated as equal members of our society. These are worthy and muscular ambitions that should continue to guide us, and we should not be entertaining any idea that the project of multiculturalism is done and dusted, or that we can say mission accomplished. Not when we still have a substantial immigration program, and not when we will still need to integrate many migrants for many years to come just yet. But I'm cautiously optimistic about how we will fare. Yes, there will be challenges. We will have some turbulent debates. But if we remain true to our values, and if we can articulate the nation-building reasons for immigration, I believe that we'll continue to be one of the world's successful multicultural societies and continue this remarkable story of ours as a nation of immigration. I look forward to the discussion we'll have very shortly, and now it's my pleasure to pass the baton on to Su McCluskey.